everyone, and welcome back to ImmunoLogic, the podcast where we take the cutting edge of immunotherapy and stitch it together with clinical insight and, of course, a few laughs to keep things lively. As always, I'm Joe Fraietta, your resident immuno-obsessive host. Now, quick confession, I didn't make ASH in person this year. Actually, I attended the American Society for Hematology 2025 meeting the modern way, which I quite like. From my laptop, fueled by coffee, group chats, and a truly unreasonable number of browser tabs, and I think a lot of people did that. So while I wasn't there physically in Orlando, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, I was absolutely there, mostly via Slack notifications and text messages from Janna. And speaking of actual boots on the ground, let me introduce my co-host, the ever insightful Dr. Janna Minehart. Janna, you survived your first, I think, in-person ASH meeting.
This
right?
was my first ASH the old-fashioned way, which I must say that I prefer to the newfangled way that I had done previously as well. I think I got a lot more out of it in person, but maybe
I'm sure.
I'm bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
No, I think it's great. It's just ASH to me is always in person when I've gone. It's very intimidating because it's so, large, I would say. I don't know, are people still taking golf carts to each section? So how are you feeling after this whirlwind of hematologic wonders, I guess?
I'm feeling inspired and excited. As someone who lived in New York for many years, New York City for many years, I don't mind the crowds.
Oh, okay, good. So for our viewers, as you may have guessed by now, we have no guest interviews today. Our guest is the science and the modern medicine itself. And hopefully during the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to break down the biggest takeaways and standout research from ASH 2025. Janna, you're in the hot seat today.
Yeah, and I'll confess that this is going to be focused in some ways on my interests as a result.
That's okay. It's good to
So
be the person.
if it feels like there's someone went to ASH with blinders on, it's because they did, because I'm a lymphoma and cellular therapy interested person.
So then can I throw a curveball at you? Could we start with AML?
Yes. Yes, we can. That
Okay.
you're referring, I'm sure, to the plenary reporting on the paradigm trial. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. The paradigm trial. You were trying to explain this to me, and not being a clinician, I sort of had no idea why this was such a showstopper. So can you maybe elaborate and tell us what, I guess, the standard of care for this type of therapy was, and then what did the phase 2 paradigm trial really show, and why was it quiet in that plenary session?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for context, the initial therapy for patients with acute myeloid leukemia has not changed significantly almost since the late 60s. A few
Wow.
years ago, there was a trial called VIALE-A that looked at less fit patients and demonstrated superiority of a regimen of azacitidine and venetoclax over what the prior induction chemotherapy strategy was that we call 7+3. That is a combination of cytarabine and anthracycline, like daunorubicin. And so that really changed the landscape for those less fit patients. And in this trial, they're reporting on comparing azacitidine and venetoclax with 7+3 for patients with intermediate and high risk AML, with some exclusion criteria that we won't go over in detail. But essentially, we always look forward to seeing a full publication to know the details more. But it really seemed like azacitidine and venetoclax may be superior to that induction chemotherapy strategy for these patients with improved event-free survival. It was almost doubled, I believe. More patients getting to transplant, fewer patients going to the ICU in the first month or two after initiating therapy. It really seemed like we were seeing superior efficacy and less toxicity, which is an extraordinary boon to these patients with this disease.
And so the transplant point is so important. I mean, I'm stating the obvious, but people often forget that the goal isn't just to get a remission, right? It's to get a remission and arrive at transplant alive and well enough to tolerate it.
Exactly. Yeah, for for these patients, we believe that transplant is the therapy that is the highest chance of being a curative one. And if you get really beat up along the way and either don't make it to transplant or don't survive your transplant, then we haven't, you know, given the optimal therapy.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
All right, so AML delivered. Maybe we could move on to
And
another
now we'll forget
plenary.
that myeloid malignancies exist and focus solely on the lymphoid ones.
That may upset some reviewers, but could we turn to CLL a little bit in a very, practical question that affects a lot of real world treatment decisions? And so this is, I guess we could call it, fixed duration or forever. The CLL3 regimen shut down, and I'll harass you a little bit about ibrutinib, but maybe we could, maybe
Yeah,
for another episode we could do that. So
yeah,
um,
you're talking about the CLL17 trial that was also one of the plenaries. Is that right?
yes, the three-arm comparison,
Yeah.
right?
And
It's,
this is a really great practical, real world kind of study looking at either continuous ibrutinib versus um, fixed duration venetoclax obinutuzumab, which is a CD20 monoclonal antibody, or fixed duration venetoclax and ibrutinib. And they had almost 900 patients or something split between these arms. And uh,
wow.
yeah, and reported basically non-inferiority when comparing I to VI and I to VO, um, with with some signals for increased toxicity in the venetoclax obinutuzumab arm, um, with increased risk of neutropenia and some infections. And so for me, this is a really interesting trial that kind of will prompt me to consider that VI fixed duration strategy for more patients than I had previously, and really limits, I think, the patients for whom I think VO would be um, most appropriate for.
Well, that's big because I think, well, I'm assuming the patients must ask all the time, do I have to be on treatment forever? And perhaps you as a clinician, you may be asking, are we trading convenience for outcomes? And so what I'm getting from you is that the, non-inferiority suggests maybe not.
Yeah, and it's like hypothesis generating too about, what impact might this have on the generation of resistance mutations to BTK, which we know is something that, um, affects a subset of patients who then need to change therapy. If they're only getting fixed duration and they benefit from, a prolonged remission, may you then retreat with the same regimen again, which would be great and kind of keeping all the tools in our toolbox available. Um,
Yeah, so we could do more with less, or I shouldn't say we, I should say you can do more with less continuous therapy, less chemo intensity, and still strong outcomes. That's pretty incredible. I get it. I get
yeah.
it.
One thing I think that trial also reflects is that, we were so lucky to have such efficacious treatments for CLL, but it does make it a little harder to study these treatments when patients do so well, kind of no matter what we give them. And you really have to follow people for a long time to really suss out the, the the outcomes and what treatments are superior. When many of these patients, their 3 year progression-free survival was in the 80 or 90%. You're doing great for for everybody. Um,
Are
and
you a big fan of staying within sort of a class? Like, stay within the BTK inhibitors before switching, or I have no idea what I'm talking about. I've
yeah,
heard
there's
this
people
from
that
like some patients actually.
Yeah, I think there are some folks, some of my mentors here who like kind of exhausting, like for example, starting with generally these days we would start with a second generation BTK inhibitor,
Uh-huh.
and then moving on to non-covalent, or we've had some of these BTK degrader trials open at Penn, and so have enrolled patients on those as well. Um, I think that I don't think that there's necessarily data to support that versus the more common strategy would probably to be in the second line. If you used a venetoclax-based therapy, first line, you'd move to a BTK-based one and vice versa.
Got it.
But you bring up a good point too, and kind of uh, uh, highlighting perhaps you're suggesting that um, the impact of ibrutinib being the BTK inhibitor used in this trial versus, again, the more commonly used these days, zanubrutinib and acalabrutinib. And I think a purist would say that we should be, giving our patients the regimens exactly as they are given in the trial. I think that in the real world, um, a lot of us feel that there's less, particularly cardiac toxicity with
Right.
um, with these second generation BTK inhibitors, and would if they were applying the results of this trial, they'd probably hope that we would get similar outcomes with non-ibrutinib BTK inhibitors.
I guess I'm surmising that maybe they started with, so you said over 900 patients, so it's been going for a while. So maybe they started with ibrutinib and maybe some of the second generations sort of evolved like as they
Right,
were
we're approved.
collected. Does that make sense? I don't know why.
Yeah, I think the other ones were approved after the trial was already going, which is you know, it's something that happens when we're doing clinical trials.
Yeah.
It does. So, in in trying to kind of piece together for myself, who would I give venetoclax obinutuzumab to? And trying to find a population that maybe I could make an argument for. There were more cardiac adverse events in both ibrutinib containing arms than the VO arm, as expected based on the known toxicity profile there. Um, and so if I were a purist that would not substitute ibrutinib for a different BTK inhibitor, then perhaps in a patient at high risk for arrhythmias, et cetera, or might be a patient that I would say the VO regimen would be superior for.
Interesting. I'm still just in awe of being able to drug BCL2. I think back to that's Novartis, right? Like the Bill Sellers days, and BCL2 was sort of like thought to be undruggable, and now it's in, I guess, your standard, right, treatment
100%
regimens for
first
for
line.
people. So it's
And
amazing
now
to
we have
see.
multiple ways of drugging it too with these BCL2 degraders.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah. All right, so ctDNA, multi-target CARs, and better engineering. So can we start with circulating tumor DNA? And I have to admit, I was in a meeting last week. I can't say which meeting, but the big question was, should we measure ctDNA in our trials? Now, this was a solid tumor trial, and it's like a bispecific product that they're trying. And everybody was like silent, and I feel like you're either a believer or you're not a believer. And then somebody said something very wise, which I don't think is going to necessarily apply to lymphoma, which we're going to talk about. But she said, a very seasoned physician, uh, well, the ctDNA measurements, that adds about $1 million to your trial. And if you have to convince people, investors in this case, about efficacy based on circulating tumor DNA levels over the scans, you're in trouble. Your product's in trouble. I digress here. So, for folks listening, ctDNA that we're talking about is essentially a liquid biopsy. It's tumor derived DNA fragments in the blood that can reflect disease burden. So, what was the vibe at ASH around ctDNA? Is this cool science? Will this really change the workflow in terms of being a prognostic tool?
Yeah, I mean, uh, I think that's so. There's multiple parts of this that I'm interested in. One is, you know, uh, how important are more detailed prognostics if it won't change your management?
Yeah.
Um, and
You're so practical. That's why we really,
um, which is not to say that I think that ctDNA will not change management necessarily in future clinical practice, and we can talk about maybe some scenarios
Right.
I can imagine it could. But like will the accessibility and and use of this be, or is it something that's just going to be a corner of a clinical trial and not something that's actually used in clinical
Yeah.
practice? Um, there's been a couple of papers and abstracts at ASH recently about ctDNA in the lymphoma space. There was a publication looking at, I believe it was large cell lymphoma, and then I believe I saw an abstract at ASH about ctDNA in Hodgkin lymphoma. And the latter is a situation where I think there is some real promise. So for context, Hodgkin lymphoma is a unique malignancy where the minority of tumor cells are actually the malignant cells, and the majority of the bulk is this inflammatory infiltrate. And one of the ways that we look at disease response, the gold standard is really with PET CTs that look at,
Right.
kind of metabolic uptake in these areas of disease. And as you might imagine, inflammatory infiltrates can also be avid on PET, and sometimes that inflammation takes longer to resolve even once you've killed all the malignant cells. And so residual PET avidity at the end of treatment for Hodgkin lymphoma is a clinical scenario that always that can be a frustrating one for clinicians, where you think you've done your job and got a great response, but there's areas on PET that are still lighting up a little bit, and sometimes you end up having to chase that down with biopsies, et cetera, only to find no tumor, no Hodgkin lymphoma, and
Oh,
put someone through a procedure. So this group, and I apologize, I don't have everyone's citations, in mind, but demonstrated kind of superiority of ctDNA in predicting response compared to again, that gold standard of PET CT. And so I can imagine a scenario where in Hodgkin lymphoma, particularly, given that kind of unique feature of the disease, ctDNA could end up being part or a significant, driver of those kind of disease response assessments.
so do you think it could replace sort of like interim imaging, especially in the context of what you're talking about in lymphomas, where we're constantly asking, is the patient responding, and if so, how deeply? Or do you think the
I
gold standard shall
can't
remain the
imagine that
gold standard?
yeah, I can't
Sorry.
imagine that it'll replace PET CTs for the near future, because I think we all really love to see the pictures and show the patients the pictures too of their
Seeing is believing, right?
yeah. But I really can see a clinical scenario where that additional piece of information would help me feel reassured that I can defer a biopsy, and do a short interval PET CT again to reevaluate avidity, or be extra concerned that I had had an inadequate treatment response and need to be thinking about next line of therapy.
So do you really think did it seem there? I saw a little bit online, but do you think groups are really starting to validate in clinical cohorts, using ctDNA levels to guide escalation or de-escalation strategies, or is it really too early to be?
I think it's early for that to be routine clinical practice, but I can see that in the near future.
Got it. All right, interesting.
But again,
So,
it's
yeah,
that I think about this the same way I think about MRD in CLL, which is something that in the CLL-17 trial they discussed, and in their New England Journal of Medicine paper they reported MRD rates that are significantly different, as in like 0% for the ibrutinib arm versus the other two. But again, the outcomes were excellent in all these groups. So the relevance of MRD, and that's MRD by flow cytometry based assay, not a sequencing based assay like with the ctDNA. But I think that some things sound obvious on paper that that we really have to validate clinically and validate the utility of these biomarkers.
Right. Right. So hopefully fewer scans, more molecular precision, more treat the patient in front of you instead of treating a schedule, hopefully in the future, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm still not a believer, but we'll see. Now, of course, we have to talk about CAR T therapy. So you mentioned to me that you were seeing a notable rise in CAR T products that target multiple antigens. That's very reassuring because I'm like, what are we doing? How many antigens are really like CD19, right? And what are we doing with these, therapies targeting one of these sort of like CAR monotherapies targeting a single antigen? So I guess what were the highlights in that setting?
Well, I think it's interesting that many of the dual targeting CARs are still targeting CD19. It's oftentimes CD19 plus.
Right, yeah.
And looking at what makes them different, or where could we find some nuance here? For example, it was interesting, they reported on one of the KITE trials with a bicistronic CD19, CD20, where the CD19 is essentially axicabtagene, salilaglucil, and the CD20 has a 4-1BB co-stimulatory domain. And so I think that when we think about dual targeting CARs, it's not just what are they targeting, it's also what are the co-stimulatory domains, is it bivalent, bicistronic? There's all these like kind of different permutations that I think probably do have a lot of relevance and may also be disease context specific. For example, knowing that BALL has a higher propensity to lose CD19 than B-cell lymphomas.
Right.
I think I did see too another interesting dual targeted CAR that was a gamma delta allogeneic CD19 CD20 CAR. And I don't know enough about gamma delta T cells, but I hear interesting things about them.
We're learning, right, in our own lab about them. We have one paper published, but more to come, I hope.
Yeah. One of the most interesting vignettes from that presentation was discussing a patient who had stable disease, and their CAR marking had disappeared, and then they had a partial response, suggesting that there was epitope spreading, and a response that was not actually directly related to cytotoxic activity of those gamma delta T cells themselves, which is really, really fascinating.
That is fascinating. Yeah, I don't think we know. From what I could see, it's like a lot of uncharted territory with gamma delta T cells. And so folks like us now are dipping our toe in this, as you know, in the lab, but it's really how do you engineer them? And they can be persistent, but how do you engineer them to be persistent, not just like how do you engineer them to be persistent and not just like short-lived effectors that, sort of disappear after the first round of antigen encounter and cytotoxicity after adoptive transfer. But I've always said I think they're much better than NK cells. I'm very comfortable with engineered NK cells with stating that. That's good. It's a totally different. What's that? I missed it. I'm sorry.
Your love of T cells is so strong.
Oh yeah, always. Always. Speaking of T cells, we shall continue with something that ties into a previous episode we've done with Bruce Levine, something that is near and dear to your heart in terms of lab projects and the large safety evaluations that we've done here in our center at Penn. So the safety corner, rare but important secondary T cell malignancies after CAR T. And, this was like the thing a couple of years ago at ASH. It's all everybody was talking about. It inspired the FDA to perhaps think about black box warnings for these T cell therapy products. So, where did it sit? Now, I didn't actually catch a lot of these presentations online. Any updates with the rare secondary T cell malignancies after CAR T therapy?
Yeah.
Anything new on the radar?
Yeah, one group did report another case, to my knowledge, previously unreported of CAR positive T cell lymphoma developing after CAR. And if I recall, it was a CD19 CAR.
High level CAR marking though, or is it just positivity that
I can't recall, and I don't know that we have great standardized quantification across institutions.
Yeah, they may have not done it.
But in any case, it was noted to have an inactivating TET2 mutation, which is interesting.
Our old friend TET2.
Yeah, our old friend TET2, which by my count now makes over 50% of the reported CAR positive T cell lymphomas post CAR. Over 50% of them have had mutations in TET2.
I did not know. Well, I haven't been keeping track like you have.
I think it's 6 out of 11 if
wow,
I recall.
So there's a there. I mean, even with a small n, I think there's something, right?
Yeah, I find that really exciting. Now, what to do about this, I think, is a real challenge given these are exceedingly rare. Even if I identified a TET2 mutation in my patient before I, proceeded with CAR, I don't think that I would not offer them CAR out of the chance that they develop this exceedingly uncommon toxicity. I think it would be really interesting and very challenging to study the incidence of T cell lymphomas in patients with B cell lymphomas. And if that changes in this new advent of T cell based therapies, not just with CAR T cells, but I wonder if that stimulation of the T cells with bispecific antibodies may similarly, increase the predisposition to development of T cell lymphomas, which we know that patients with B cell lymphomas already are at higher risk for T cell lymphomas. So again, this is a kind of
that's really interesting.
I'd love to think that we can get this out of it might be really hard. It's certainly a little easier if you can find that CAR marking to make a direct correlation.
I mean, the one thing, as we saw in our study is though there was trafficking of CAR T cells sometimes so even though, you detected CAR marking, it was really the CAR wasn't a driver of the malignancy probably, or of the outgrowth, but we still reported it as positivity. Yeah. But I think, what this still says to me is that we need really better frameworks for monitoring and for investigating unusual secondary malignancies when they occur. And now with the in vivo products, time will tell as well.
Absolutely.
All right, so I'm definitely putting you on the spot. If you had to summarize ASH 2025 in one sentence, what would it be? You're great at this. This is the only reason you're great at this. You could,
Oh my goodness. Well, with the caveat that my ASH experience is limited again to
what you like,
lymphomas and cellular therapies in large part, I think I saw, increasing combination therapies, and, combination CAR targeting. And I think it still remains to be seen how that may improve outcomes versus sequencing therapies. I think that one trial that highlights that for me was reports of an epcoritamab trial in follicular lymphoma,
Uh-huh.
comparing rituximab and lenalidomide to rituximab, lenalidomide, epcoritamab, which is a CD20, CD3 bispecific, is second line in follicular lymphoma. So we call the R squared and then R squared epcor, I suppose. And there were, higher CR, complete response rates, great duration of response. But again, it's hard to know for me with the available information, is that actually better than having given R squared in the second line and then epcoritamab in the third line, for example. I think that these trials, again, follicular lymphoma has the blessing and the curse that CLL does, where many of these patients do really well. And so people that have responses can have really long responses. These trials are ones that often need to be large and run for a long time to get that kind of granularity, and trials of sequencing therapy are just really hard.
Right. Well, thank you. I learned a lot. So I think that's a wrap to everybody listening.
Can
Thanks.
we talk about one more trial?
Oh, yeah. I don't want to cut you off. Sure.
Yeah, because just there's one presentation that really has me befuddled, and I hope we can learn more. This was there were actually a couple presentations reporting on this trial of a CD22 CAR, which I think in their phase 3 is called Furacell. And as compared to the phase 1 before it got that name, in this later larger trial, they did shorter manufacturing time, but not significantly shorter. I think it was 5 to 7 days versus 12 days.
Right.
Wasn't even one of these like 3-day manufacturing that some folks are doing. And they saw substantially more immune effector cell HLH-like syndrome, IECHS.
Yeah.
And where in the phase 1 trial, they had patients that had really beautiful long responses. They had really inferior response rates and really short responses that they ended up closing the trial because of both increased toxicity and decreased effectiveness. And so I think that sometimes the CAR manufacturing is a black box that we don't always fully understand all the details of. And I hope that more details of manufacturing can be reported, because I think that in this study and in others, we've seen that it can really affect the CAR T cell potency, that those few days of those T cells' lives can affect their ability to persist and be cytotoxic for months to years afterwards, which is really remarkable.
Yeah, you're right. And it always is a black box. And, I know with a lot of the commercial products, it's hard to get any information on how they were manufactured. So, but definitely, I think we're seeing hints of that all over the place. No, very interesting.
But I'm hopeful that, if we see these hints that you can, that apparently small tweaks in manufacturing can have significant effects on cytotoxicity and persistence. I'm hopeful that means also that there are tweaks that we can do to improve the cytotoxicity and persistence. And again, that affecting even just things in the manufacturing period might have large clinical benefits.
Definitely. Well, I hope our viewers enjoyed the episode. So if you've enjoyed the conference style episode with Janna in the hot seat, do let us know. And if you went to ASH and saw something we didn't cover, I'm sure there are lots of things.
All of my hematology and all of myeloid malignancies.
Yes, we could keep this going for days. But we always want to hear what lit up your brain, really. So until next time, be well, stay immunological, and we'll catch you on the next episode of ImmunoLogic.